Pam Bondi had been in tough courtrooms before, but this one felt different the moment she stepped inside. Judge Malcolm Raines sat at the bench, barely acknowledging her as she approached the plaintiff's table. He had a reputation for being sharp-tongued, unpredictable, and brutal with attorneys he didn't respect. Bondi knew she wasn't just here to prosecute a case, she was walking into a fight. The defendant, Vincent Greco, was a real estate mogul with deep political ties, accused of funneling taxpayer money into his personal projects. The evidence was solid, the paper trail was airtight, but Bondi could already tell that getting a conviction wouldn't be as simple as laying out the facts. Judge Raines flipped through a file, taking his time, letting the silence stretch long enough to make everyone in the courtroom The heavy oak paneling of the courtroom absorbed every sound except for the occasional cough and the quiet shuffle of papers. Bondi kept her expression neutral, refusing to acknowledge his stalling tactics. Finally, without even looking up, Raines spoke. "Miss Bondi, I assume you've prepared something of substance today, or should we just skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" A few chuckles rippled through the back of the courtroom, mostly from Greco's legal team, who were clearly enjoying the show. Bondi didn't flinch. She had dealt with worse than this. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself," she said, her voice steady, refusing to rise to his bait. "This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to ensure the facts are presented accurately." Raines leaned back in his chair, an exaggerated sigh escaping him as if he had already heard enough. "Taxpayer dollars, right?" he said with mock boredom. "Because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before." Bondi's jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't let it show. She knew this was a game, and she wasn't about to play by his rules. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous," she said, keeping her tone controlled. For a brief moment, their eyes met as cold and unreadable, hers unwavering and full of resolve. But before she could continue, he cut her off again, his voice dripping with condescension. "Mrs. Bondi, spare me the lectures, just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." A murmur spread through the courtroom, a quiet acknowledgement that something wasn't right. Judges could be tough, but this was something else. This was personal. Bondi took a slow breath, recognizing what was happening. Raines wasn't just challenging her, he was trying to control the tempo of the case, trying to throw her off balance. He wanted her to fluster, to react, to lose composure in front of the jury and the press. But she wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. She picked up a folder from the table, flipping it open with measured precision. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate." "Miss Bondi," Raines interrupted again, his voice carrying that same smug edge. "Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of compensating?" The comment landed like a slap, and the reaction in the room was immediate. The defense attorney smirked. A few reporters in the gallery exchanged glances, and even the bailiff shifted slightly. Bondi, however, remained completely still, not even a flicker of emotion crossing her face. She had learned a long time ago that men like Judge Raines thrived on intimidation. The only way to beat them: never let them see you rattle. She paused just long enough to make a statement without saying a word. Then, slowly and deliberately, she set the folder down, clasped her hands together, and met his gaze. "Your Honor, if you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have." Her words were calm, controlled, and lethal, just enough of a warning without stepping out of line. The air in the room shifted, tension curling through the gallery like an electric charge. Judge Raines' lips twitched, the corner of his mouth curling slightly. Was that amusement, or was it something else? "Oh, I don't have concerns, Miss Bondi," he said after a pause, his voice slow and measured. "I just know a weak case when I see one." This time the reaction wasn't just murmurs, there were gasps. Someone in the gallery whispered something under their breath. A reporter scribbled furiously in his notepad. This wasn't just judicial toughness anymore, this was something else entirely. Judges weren't supposed to declare a case weak in open court before hearing the full argument. And yet, Raines had just done exactly that. Bondi could feel the weight of the moment, the shift in energy as eyes flicked between her and Raines, like a slow-moving storm about to break. But she wasn't going to engage in a shouting match. That's exactly what he wanted. Instead, she adjusted her blazer, straightened her papers, and looked him dead in the eye. "Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking." The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not. And for the first time, she saw something flicker in Raines' expression, not just arrogance, not just condescension, but something else. It was the look of a man with something to hide. And that's when she knew. This wasn't just about courtroom theatrics. Judge Raines wasn't just being combative for sport. He had a stake in this case. But what he didn't know, so did she. Rings before, but this felt different. Judge Raines wasn't just ruling from the bench, he was playing a game, a calculated, deliberate attempt to undermine her credibility in front of the entire courtroom. He wasn't just being difficult. He was trying to bury this case before it even began. But why? She could feel the weight of his stare as she continued speaking, watching for any sign of weakness. Every word she spoke, he was waiting to pounce, to find a flaw, to shut her down. She could see it, the slight curl of his lips, the slow tap of his fingers on the bench, the way his eyes never quite met the evidence screen. He was daring her to push further. She wasn't about to stop. "Your Honor," she said, keeping her tone even, "these documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly triple the amount approved in the original budget, and none of it was accounted for in the state records." She turned slightly, gesturing toward the projection screen, where the financial statements were displayed. If Raines had been paying attention, he would see the proof staring him in the face. "Now, if you look here." "Miss Bondi," Raines cut in again, this time sharper, faster, as if trying to stop her from finishing her sentence. "I hate to interrupt your presentation, really I do, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day." Bondi glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of the case, right?" He scoffed. "And yet I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this." There it was again. That phrase, wasting time. He was trying to shut her down before she could expose something bigger. But Pam Bondi had just found the first crack in his wall. Pam Bondi could feel the air shifting in the courtroom. Judge Malcolm Raines wasn't just being difficult, he was actively blocking the case. His interruptions weren't just about control. They were about stopping her from revealing something. The problem was he had already overplayed his hand. His dismissiveness, his sneering, his outright refusal to hear the motion, it was too much. And now Bondi wasn't the only one who had noticed. She could see it in the jury's eyes, the way they were starting to exchange glances, fidgeting in their seats. She could see it in the gallery, where even the reporters had stopped writing and were simply watching. The tension was no longer just between her and the judge, it was in the entire room. The moment was fragile, like a glass teetering on the edge of a table. And Bondi knew exactly how to tip it over. She flipped the next page in her file, acting as if nothing was wrong. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "I'd like to continue presenting my evidence." A beat of silence passed before Raines finally nodded, though his lips pressed into a thin line. "Proceed. But keep it brief." Bondi didn't acknowledge the jab. Instead, she lifted a document from her stack and placed it on the projector screen. "This is a contract signed between the defendant, Vincent Greco, and the city's planning board outlining the proposed project expenses." She clicked the remote, pulling up the next page. "You'll notice the listed cost totals just over $2 million, she continued. However, she placed another document side by side on the screen. This is an internal ledger from the defendant's company. The numbers were clear. The actual amount transferred was nearly double. A low murmur rippled through the gallery as people absorbed the discrepancy. Then she pulled out a third document. "And here," Bondi said, her voice carrying just a fraction louder, "is the approval signature." Signed off by, she hesitated just for a second, letting the weight of the moment land. "Judge Malcolm Raines." The courtroom didn't just shift. It cracked. A ripple of movement spread as heads turned. People whispered. And a reporter dropped his pen onto his notepad. On the defense side, Vincent Greco stiffened, his lawyer's jaw tightening as he flipped through his own files. Even the bailiff, normally stone-faced, shifted on his feet. But the most telling reaction came from Raines himself. For the first time since the hearing began, he went completely still. His hands, which had been resting comfortably on the bench, clasped together tightly. His mouth, usually quick to deliver a sarcastic remark, formed a thin, hard line. He wasn't leaning back anymore, he was bracing himself. Bondi saw it all. She had just put him on the defensive. Raines exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. "Miss Bondi," he said. His voice notably lower approached the bench. The entire courtroom hushed. It wasn't a request. Bondi hesitated for only a second, then set down her papers and walked forward, meeting his eyes with complete control. As soon as she reached the bench, Raines leaned in slightly, his voice just above a whisper. "I'd strongly suggest," he murmured, "that you reconsider the direction you're taking here." Bondi tilted her head, her expression calm. "Excuse me. I'm saying," Raines continued, "some fights aren't worth having." She let the words hang between them, measuring every syllable. Then, with deliberate precision, She leaned in just an inch, closer, and murmured back, "I don't scare easily, Judge Raines." A muscle in his jaw twitched. She turned and walked back to her table, her mind racing. That wasn't just a power move. That was a warning. Pam Bondi sat down, adjusting her papers as if nothing had happened, but inside she was already processing everything. Raines wasn't just an obstacle, he was protecting someone. The real question was, how deep did this go? Her prosecution team shifted uncomfortably beside her, waiting for her reaction. She didn't give them one. Instead, she lifted her chin and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence." Raines didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger, as if deciding how far he wanted to push. Finally, after a long moment, he nodded. "Proceed." Bondi reached for the next file. "This document," she said, placing another page on the screen, "was obtained through a subpoena." Raines' tone shifted instantly. "Miss Bondi," she stopped, looking at him. He was no longer leaning back, no longer dismissive. His hands were clasped tightly together. His mouth was a thin, hard line. The entire room felt it. Bondi's heart pounded, but she kept her voice calm. "Your Honor," she said, "would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant?" For the first time since she had stepped into this courtroom, Judge Malcolm Raines had no response. The defense attorney shifted, glancing between his client and the judge. Vincent Greco, normally arrogant and unshaken, sat stone-faced, gripping the edge of the table. Bondi let the silence stretch, then continued. "This document," she said carefully, "is critical financial evidence." Raines finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat, his fingers pressing together, his knuckles whitening. "That document," he said slowly, "is inadmissible." Bondi tilted her head slightly. "How so?" "It was obtained improperly." She let that sink in. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "this document was subpoenaed by my office." His nostrils flared. "Then it was mishandled." "I'm ruling it inadmissible." This time, the shift wasn't just in the gallery, it was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff, everyone was watching. Bondi folded her arms. "You do realize," she said, "this is a public hearing, correct? That the media is here. That every single person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without reason." A muscle in Raines' jaw jumped. "That's enough, Miss Bondi." She didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly she reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small recorder. She placed it on the table and pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom. Low, gruff, unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how." The recording crackled, then continued. "Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers." Silence. Absolute. Suffocating. Silence. Raines didn't move, didn't breathe. Bondi didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Because now every single person in this courtroom had just heard him, and the real game was about to begin. The recording ended, leaving the courtroom in absolute silence. No murmurs, no whispered reactions, just the stunning realization that Judge Malcolm Raines had been caught. Pam Bondi sat motionless, her hands resting on the table, her expression a mask of calm. She didn't need to say anything, the evidence had spoken for itself. Across the room, Vincent Greco's defense team crumbled. His attorney, usually composed, fumbled with his papers, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The jury exchanged wide-eyed glances, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding. Even the reporters, veterans of countless political scandals, paused mid-sentence, realizing they had just witnessed something historic. But it was Judge Raines' reaction that sealed everything. His hands, once relaxed, had curled into fists on the bench. His normally smug demeanor had vanished, replaced by a rigid stillness that only one thing could explain: fear. For the first time in his courtroom, he was not in control. Bondi let the silence stretch, knowing the longer it lasted, the deeper it cut. She folded her hands together, her gaze locked onto Raines with calculated patience. Then she spoke, her voice steady, sharp. "Your Honor, would you like to explain why a sitting judge appears to be conspiring to obstruct justice?" The reaction was instantaneous. The gallery erupted into a flurry of hushed exclamations. Reporters scribbled frantically, and the bailiff shifted on his feet. Raines' mouth opened, then closed, his jaw tightening as he grasped for an answer. But Bondi had seen this before, the look of a man caught with nowhere to run. Raines exhaled sharply, his composure cracking, and leaned forward. "This is outrageous," he snapped. his voice carrying a new edge of desperation. "This hearing has turned into a circus, thanks to your grandstanding." Bondi didn't blink she wasn't letting him out of this. She tilted her head slightly, letting the weight of the room bear down on him. "Chaos?" she echoed, her voice light but sharp. "No, Your Honor. I'd say this is clarity." The moment hung there, electric, before Rains broke eye contact. His fingers curled against the bench, his breathing slightly uneven now. It wasn't just Bondi who saw it, the jury. The press, the entire courtroom witnessed the crack in his armor. Bondi reached into her folder and pulled out another document, sliding it toward the bailiff. "This," she said, her tone measured, "is a transcript of a wiretap legally obtained during our investigation." She turned back to Rains, her stare unyielding. "Shall we read it aloud?" For the first time, Rains hesitated. His fingers twitched against the bench, and his eyes darted toward the gallery, a fraction too quick, a fraction too telling. The judge who had ruled over others with absolute control was now calculating his own next move. Bondi turned to the bailiff, nodding. "Officer Reynolds, please read the highlighted section." The officer hesitated for only a second before lifting the document, his voice clear. "We'll take care of her. Bondi doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom." The courtroom erupted into chaos. A reporter's pen clattered to the floor, a juror leaned forward, and even Greco's own legal team stiffened in horror. Rains, for the first time, looked lost. His grip on the bench was tighter now, his knuckles turning white because he knew it was over. Bondi took her time, allowing the moment to sink into everyone in the room. Then, in the calmest voice she could muster, she slid another paper across the table. "Your Honor," she said, "this is official evidence. Would you like to rule it inadmissible too?" Rains' nostrils flared, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. "That document," he said, his voice strained, "is inadmissible." Bondi's expression didn't change, but the energy in the courtroom shifted. The jury wasn't buying it anymore. Bondi folded her arms, waiting. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice razor sharp. Rains' jaw tightened, his silence speaking louder than any excuse he could conjure. The damage was done, his authority had shattered. Then it happened. Rains' eyes flickered, for just a moment, toward the exit. A small movement, barely noticeable, but to Bondi it was everything. He wasn't thinking about defending himself anymore. He was thinking about escape. Bondi didn't give him the chance. She turned toward the back of the courtroom and gave a single subtle nod. A door opened. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor. Then came the words that sealed Rains' fate. "Judge Malcolm Rains, you are under arrest." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The reporters scrambled for their phones, cameras clicked, and the jury stared in stunned disbelief. Even Greco, the man who had walked into court expecting a mere formality, suddenly looked terrified. Rains didn't move. He didn't even blink. His body remained stiff, his hands gripping the bench as if it could anchor him in place. But it was too late. Two uniformed officers flanked him now, one reaching into his pocket, the other pulling out a set of cuffs. The sound of metal against metal was deafening. "This is absurd," Rains muttered, though the fight had already left his voice. The officer holding his arm remained unmoved. "You have the right to remain silent." And for the first time in his career, Judge Malcolm Rains actually was. Bondi watched, unflinching, as the officers pulled him to his feet. The man who had spent years controlling courtrooms, bending laws, and shielding the powerful now stood powerless. His once commanding presence was reduced to a man in cuffs. Rains' eyes darted toward the gallery, desperate, searching for anyone who might save him. But no one spoke. No one moved. Because it wasn't a mistake. It was the truth finally catching up to him. Bondi finally stood, adjusting her blazer. Rains turned toward her, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something, to argue, to deny. But before he could, she beat him to it. "Not anymore." The officers led him away, and the weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. The legacy of a corrupt judge had crumbled in real time. And yet Bondi knew this wasn't the end. She turned back toward Greco, whose face had drained of color. His lawyer whispered something hurriedly, but Greco barely heard him. He was still watching Rains disappear through the door. Bondi walked to her table, stacking her papers calmly. Then she turned to Greco. "Well," she said, her voice even, "would you like to continue with today's proceedings? Or do you want to talk?" Greco swallowed hard, his fingers tapping against the table. He was still processing how quickly his safety net had been ripped away. His lawyer turned toward him, but Bondi could already see the answer forming on his lips. "If I do," Greco finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want protection." Bondi nodded slowly, the trial room still buzzing with shock. "Then you better start talking." Because this wasn't just about a judge anymore. This was about something much bigger. The courtroom still buzzed with the shock of what had just happened. Judge Malcolm Raines was gone, led away in cuffs, his career in ruins, his corruption exposed for the world to see. But Pam Bondi wasn't done yet. The trial was still ongoing, and there was one more man in the room whose fate had yet to be decided: Vincent Greco. He sat stiffly at the defense table, his fingers tapping against the polished wood, his eyes flicking between Bondi and his lawyer. His smug confidence, so apparent at the beginning of this case, had evaporated the moment Raines was taken away. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. But Greco wasn't listening. His world had just turned upside down. Bondi saw it in his expression, the calculation, the panic, the dawning realization that he was next. He had expected to walk out of this courtroom untouched, shielded by Raines, protected by a system that had always worked in his favor. But the system had just collapsed right in front of him. She took a step forward, her voice measured, controlled. "Mr. Greco, I'll ask you again," she said, letting the silence stretch. "Would you like to continue with today's proceedings, or do you want to talk?" Greco's lawyer spoke first, his voice rushed, defensive. "My client has no further comments at this time," he said quickly, trying to regain some control. But Greco barely seemed to hear him. His mind was racing, weighing his options, calculating the fallout. He knew that staying silent could mean prison. Bondi watched him carefully, sensing his hesitation. "Mr. Greco, let me be clear," she said, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. "Judge Raines was your shield. He was your leverage. He was the man who ensured this trial was a mere formality." She let the words sink in, let them settle like heavy stones. Greco's eyes flickered, the first real crack in his resolve. Bondi pressed forward. "But Raines is gone," she continued. "And now you're left standing alone." She let the moment stretch, the weight of his isolation suffocating. The tension in the room was unbearable. The jury held their breath. The reporters leaned in. The court officials exchanged glances. Everyone was waiting for Greco's next move. Then, finally he spoke. "If I talk," Greco said, his voice low, barely above a whisper, "I want protection." Bondi nodded, as if she had been expecting this all along. "That depends on what you have to offer." Greco licked his lips, glancing at his lawyer, who shook his head violently. "Vincent," the attorney hissed, "don't do this." But Greco ignored him. He knew there was no way out now, not unless he flipped. He exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly, and looked straight at Bondi. "I can give you names," he said. "Real names. The people who made this happen." His voice was steadier now, like a man who had just accepted his fate. Bondi didn't blink. "Then let's hear them." Greco hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only Bondi and a few people around him could hear. "This goes all the way up." The words sent a chill through the courtroom. Bondi glanced at her team, then back at Greco. "How far up?" she asked, her voice calm, but inside she could already feel the magnitude of what was unfolding. Greco exhaled sharply. "State officials," he said, "people in the governor's office, developers, businessmen." Raines was just one piece of the puzzle. He rubbed his hands together, his nervous energy spilling into the room. The weight of his confession hung in the air. The courtroom wasn't just a trial anymore, it had turned into the beginning of something much bigger. The reporters were furiously scribbling down notes, their hands flying over their keyboards, knowing that they had just stumbled into something that would be on the front page for weeks. Bondi kept her expression neutral, but inside her mind was already racing. She had come here to convict Greco, but now she had an entirely new war to fight. If what he was saying was true, then this case was just the surface of something deeper, darker. Judge Raines had fallen, but he was just the first domino. Bondi turned toward the judge's empty seat, then back at Greco. "You're willing to testify?" she asked, her voice steady. Greco hesitated for only a second before nodding. "I want a deal," he said. "I want protection." Bondi took a slow breath, letting the moment sink in. Then she extended her hand. "Then let's make one." Greco reached forward, his hand shaking slightly, and took hers. And with that, the floodgates opened. The courtroom wasn't the same place it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had shifted. The walls that once protected the powerful had begun to crack, and Pam Bondi had just sent a message to everyone watching. No one was above the law. Reins had fallen. Greco had flipped. And now an entirely new case was beginning. Bondi turned to her team, her mind already racing with the next steps. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge or one greedy businessman. This was about a system that had been rotting from the inside. The reporters were already leaving the room, their phones buzzing with breaking news alerts. The jury remained seated, still processing the history they had just witnessed. Greco sat slumped at the defense table, a man who had lost everything but a chance to save himself. And Bondi, she simply gathered her papers, straightened her blazer, and walked toward the exit. Because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Justice isn't just about laws, it's about courage. It's about standing up, even when the system is stacked against you, even when those in power try to silence the truth. Pam Bondi walked into that courtroom, thinking she was fighting a corrupt businessman, but what she uncovered was something much bigger. She faced intimidation, resistance, and threats, yet she never backed down. Why? Because the truth always matters. This story is a reminder that no one is untouchable. People like Judge Reins and Vincent Greco built their power on lies, believing they would never face consequences. But in the end, they fell not because the system let them, but because someone had the guts to push back. It only takes one voice, one moment of defiance to break the cycle of corruption. In life, you will face obstacles, powerful figures who try to suppress you, who want you to stay quiet. But remember this, the moment you choose to fight, the moment you refuse to be intimidated, is the moment the game changes. Stand tall, speak up, because the truth always wins.